everybody this morning, the last day of the conference. I'm very happy there's still a lot of people around. So we start with Laura Downing on prosodic phrasing in Proto-Bantu.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for getting up and coming to my talk. Yes, and also thank you for coming to listen to what I think is a totally unexplored topic in reconstructing Proto-Bantu. Yeah, when I was told that I should be trying to imagine what prosodic phrasing was like, I thought, well, we don't know anything about the prosody and we don't know much about the syntax, which is also important. Right, so this will be a very speculative talk, and I hope it'll provoke discussion at the end. Okay, so for the synchronic phrasal prosody, though there is a certain amount of work, starting in the 70s. So Larry's work with others on Haya, and then Kisworth and Abhishek on Chimini are among the very earliest works on prosodic phrasing in Bantu languages. So we can see that the interest in prosodic phrasing goes back some time, and since then there have been what looks like quite a bit of work on the topic, yeah, stretching from the 70s through quite recently. But if you look at what's actually out there, there are far too few languages represented. So what I'll be doing in this talk is, first of all, giving a survey of what's out there based on the literature that I could find. Yeah, so again, with the caveat that there isn't as much work on prosodic phrasing and a variety of detailed work on the prosodic phrasing as you would like. And I think it's not just my own weakness. I know I'm weakest at Western Bantu, but I think it's not just because of me that my own weakness is that I have the impression that there's not enough work in Western Bantu languages. So I admit from the beginning that those languages are underrepresented in my sample. Yeah, so, and then due to time constraints then, other limits to my survey are that first of all, I'm only looking at phrasing conditioned by syntax, well, a little bit at phrasing conditioned by topics, but I don't think there's much evidence that focus conditions phrasing in Bantu languages, so this will not be taken up in this talk. And I'm only looking at phrasing in, say, main sentences with one simple clause, not at phrasing with subordinate clauses, even though that's an interest of mine. It's something I'm very, very interested in. There's almost no data on phrasing in complex sentences. Okay, so the structure of the talk. In each section, first I survey what I could find about phrasing at different, what you could call syntactic levels. So I'll start with evidence for prosodic phrasing where the entire sentence, very informally defined, is one prosodic phrase, and then I'll move to a couple of different types of smaller constituents, so constituents smaller than the sentence, where you find fairly widespread evidence for phrasing. Yeah, so I'll start with, for each constituent then, I survey the types of prosody that have been attested in a range of Bantu languages, as wide a range as I could find. And then I'll conclude each section by speculating on the implications of the survey for reconstructing Proto-Bantu. Okay, so starting with sentence level prosody, I'm assuming that, that in synchronic Bantu languages, the basic word order is something like what we have here, subject, verb. If you have two objects, and it's what you might call the indirect object comes first, and then an oblique. So obliques don't separate the two objects or separate the verb from the object. Right, and again, I define a simple sentence quite theory neutrally as a constituent that potentially contains all of these smaller constituents. Okay, so what prosody do we find at the sentence level? I'll be looking at two kinds, or two or three kinds. So first, prosody that takes the entire sentence as its domain. And there, what we find rather commonly, you can see well, yeah, we're getting pretty far south. Yeah, so we're getting from A at least through P. We're getting examples of high tone realization processes which potentially take the entire sentence as their domain. So here I have an example from Chilungu, which is spoken in Zambia. And what we find is that high tone doubling potentially goes from any word to any following word. So in the first example we have, yeah, I bolded, so we have a high tone on the subject doubling to the verb, from the verb to an object, a verb to object, and from one object to another object. Yeah, so high tone doubling takes place across all the constituents of a sentence without any restrictions. Another kind of process that you find that takes the entire sentence as its domain is downstep or declination, yeah, which then affects the realization of high tones. So we see in this example from Shingazija, yeah, you can see there are 4 high tones at this sentence. This is a language where there's only a contrast between high tone and nothing. And what we notice here is that each high tone is realized lower and lower than the next one. And again, it's across the sentence that this lowering process is calculated. What I want you to notice already is that this final high tone is really, really, really low. Yeah, it's lower than you would expect, even going down. You might expect it to be here, but it's way down there. Okay, so I wanted to point out, though, that even though it's often said that we would expect declination or downstep in any Bantu language, that's our default expectation, that expectation is wrong. You should, yeah. And a language like Mboshi shows that this is wrong. So Mboshi actually is a Bantu language, a Western Bantu language, where high and low tone contrast. You need low tones underlyingly. And in spite of that, you can see that there's no downstep between high tones, that the first several tones are roughly on the same level, and it's only at the end of the sentence that we start, the pitch starts going down. And again, the final high tone is realized considerably lower than the others. Okay, so far we've looked at processes that take the entire sentence as their domain and perhaps define some cohesion among all the constituents of the sentence. So some high tone processes take the entire sentence as their domain, and then downstep or declination, which affects the realization of tone, can also takes a large structure, an entire sentence as a domain. So now I want to turn to sentence final prosody. And, well, I think I want to keep this. So one of the very first types, the first type of sentence final prosody that I want to take up is what's called final lowering. So what is final lowering? It's the case that we can see, you saw in Shingazija and in Mboshi, where a final high tone, or maybe the last, well, roughly the final high tone, is realized lower than expected, even given downstep in the language. Yeah, so we can see, especially in Mboshi, there's actually no downstep in the language, but the last 2 high tones start going down in a stairwise fashion. And I pointed out when we looked at Shingazija that even though we had sort of terracing with the high tones going down, the last high tone was brought way down, much lower than you might expect. Okay, so I've done a recent survey of the types of final lowering that you find cross-Bantu. And again, if anyone knows of other types of final lowering, please let me know. This is a preliminary survey based on just a few languages. Yeah, so one type of final lowering that you find, we'll start with the one we've already seen, where just the final syllable, or perhaps the last 2 high tones, are realized lower. Yeah, so I have a couple of languages in that category. Another effect of final lowering is to have a falling tone for high tones to be realized as falls at the ends of sentences. Yeah, there's some people in this room whose work I've cited here, and I hope I've represented your work correctly. I know you'll let me know if I didn't. Yeah, so the one, of course, Jita is one of these languages, and they're very common in the data Yeah, so here is an example of Gita declarative intonation. Yeah, we're in a phrase like, well, okay, I have a terrible accent in every language I speak, so this is totally, yeah, non-native speaker-like pronunciation of Gita. Yeah, it was something like chama humo mume. Yeah, so mume. It's a definite fall at the end of the sentence. And we know that these falls are not underlying because if we put words with final falls in phrase medial position, what we see is that, well, the fall disappears. Okay, it's a little complicated to see this because Gita is a language that has high tone shift. High tones are always realized one syllable to the, well, not to the right, but you know what I mean. One syllable to the right on the following syllable. Yeah, and this goes across word boundaries. So here we have the high tone of okufwa in isolation. Its high tone is realized on the next syllable. The same in the next example. Yeah, so what we know from that is that, well, if this were an underlying fall, it should block high tone shift. Yeah, but since shift takes place, we know that that's a high tone, and the fall is a phrase final or sentence final phenomenon. Okay, so that's the second type of effect of final lowering on a, yeah, to have a fall. And then the third type of final lowering that turns up in my survey is for a string of high tones to be compressed at the end of a sentence. Okay, so Bimba provides an example of this. Yeah, so I think this Bimba example is nice because you can see in phrase sentence medial position, high tones fall. Yeah, but at sentence final position, you can see that this string of high tones is at roughly the same level as the low tone that comes before them. Okay, so I'm not as familiar with Bimba as I am with Chichewa. You get the same phenomenon in Chichewa, and somehow these compressed high tones sound different from a low. Even though on a pitch track they look just the same, they do sound different from a low. Yeah, so that's why they're represented here as high tones, with the lowered pitch resulting from lowering, not from deletion of the high tone. Okay, so these are some, so final lowering is found in a lot of Bantu languages and a lot of different zones of the Bantu speaking area. And again, final lowering has 3 different kinds of effects on final high tones. Yeah, I wanted to point out that that these studies were looking more at the intonation. I guess you could call final lowering an intonational effect that involves lowering of final high tones. What's gotten a lot more discussion in the Bantu tone literature is the fact that that there's a phenomenon of avoidance of sentence final high tones. Yeah, so Kisworth and Oden in their Bantu book, tone article, give a lot of different examples of this and highlight the avoidance of high tones as a feature really of tone in Bantu languages. So just to give a few examples here of what they mean by avoidance of high tones on final syllables. From Gita again, we said all high tones shift one syllable to the right. So yeah, I know I made a mistake here. It should be oku, okay, oku wonana, and oku wona. Yeah, so wonana, you can see the high tone shifts one syllable to the right, but here the high tone doesn't shift because shift would be to the final syllable, and we're avoiding high tones on the final syllable. Okay, Tsonga, we have a very similar example, except this is a language that has tone doubling rather than tone shift. So here we have a high tone doubling, tuma, in phrase medial position, but in phrase final position, the high tone stays put. And then in Chichewa, we have an interesting range of effects depending on the dialect. Yeah, so here we have underlyingly a set of nouns that have high tones on the final syllable. Okay, so how do they get realized in phrase final position? So first notice we have penal lengthening. Yeah, but then we have penal lengthening. Then also we have something happening to the tone. Yeah, so in the Encheo dialect, this is Alan Penje's dialect, we get, one finds partial retraction. So you still have a high tone on the final syllable, but also one more in. Okay, and in the Nkota dialect, yeah, you lose the high tone on the final syllable, just keep the high tone one more in. And then the Kasungu dialect, yeah, there are falls on the penult syllable for all of these words. Yeah, so these are then different cases of avoidance of sentence final high tones that you find in the literature. And yeah, like I said, I think this phenomenon is related to the final lowering phenomenon that we were just looking at in the section before. I didn't put this on the handout, but just responding to some of the discussion from yesterday, we saw that metatony is another tonal phenomenon that has a result of, where the alternation is basically that you have a high tone in phrase medial position and a low tone in phrase final position. And I'm just throwing this out as an idea that perhaps metatony can be thrown into this general picture of avoidance of high tones phrase finally or sentence finally in Bantu languages. Okay, so these have all been effects on tone, but there are also some lengthening effects that you find with signaling phrase or sentence final position in a number of Bantu languages. Yeah, so the penult vowel is the one that's gotten all the discussion. So the penult vowel is often lengthened in some kind of final position. It's often hard to tell final what in the data because often words are given in isolation. Word in isolation shows you that at least in word final position and also sentence final position, you get phrase final, you get penult lengthening, but it doesn't tell you anything about whether they're intermediate domains. Okay, but in languages like Northern Sotho, the domain for final lengthening is definitely the entire sentence, including adverbials. And we can see this from this data set. Yeah, this is another language where vowel length is not contrastive, so the only long vowels you see are found in penult syllables. And the penult syllables are always the last word in the entire sentence, whether that last word is a nominal complement or an adverbial complement. Okay, so then a final lengthening phenomenon that you might expect to find in Bantu languages is lengthening of the final syllable and also devoicing of the final syllable. Yeah, so unfortunately, neither of these phenomena have been very widely studied phonetically. Because of work on Chichewa, I guess I've started obsessing about final devoicing, and now I hear it everywhere, but it's almost never described in a very scientific way. So, yeah, so Canerva already observed in Chichewa that it's not just the penult syllable that's lengthened in phrase final position. In sentence final position, it's both the penult and the final vowel that are considerably lengthened. And a phonetic study that I did with, unfortunately, the late Bertrand Marshall confirmed this. Yeah, Myers has done a careful study for Kinyarwanda, and then David Odin, in his work on Kimatumbi, noticed that the final lengthening was clear enough or noticeable enough that he proposed it as a phonological process of the language. Yeah. So what are the implications for Proto-Bantu? Yeah, so I think it should be relatively uncontroversial to say that Proto-Bantu, like most modern Bantu languages, most modern languages altogether, would have had some kind of, that the sentence would have been a prosodic domain, but a prosodic domain for what? Okay, so I would say it's likely to have been a domain for some kind of tone realization processes. So it's likely that it had tonal processes that applied across word boundaries for a sentence medially, but not across sentences. I think it's also likely that there is some kind of final lowering And again, this is cross-linguistically quite common, but we see this, yeah, all over the Bantu-speaking world. And again, in studies that are mostly phonological, the avoidance of high tones, final high tones, is mentioned as a characteristic property of Bantu tone systems. Yeah, so declination, it's not so clear. We would want to reconstruct that. The same is true of P-note lengthening. Yeah, I might not go over this code in detail, but yeah, so in Larry's very thorough and detailed survey of P-note lengthening, he concluded that it was more of an aerial phenomenon in modern Bantu languages, that it was mostly found in Eastern and Southern languages. But he did mention that there is an alternative point of view, that it's possible that P-note lengthening and the deletion and devoicing of final vowels go together. And deletion of final vowels is something that's found well in Western Bantu. Yeah, so again, this is just thrown out as something to think about. My gut feeling is I agree with Larry that in modern Bantu languages it seems to be an aerial phenomenon, but there might be more to think about there. Yeah, but final lengthening, again, I think that's just understudied, and we ought to be taking a closer look at final lengthening and final devoicing in a range of Bantu languages. Okay, so what do we find below the sentence? Okay, so here I'm going to look at a couple of different ways of chunking sentences into smaller domains, yeah, smaller than the sentence, starting with a couple of potential topics. I mean, yeah, a couple of cases where you could argue that topicalization influences phrasing. And I'll start then with the phrasing of subjects. So as we heard in a talk yesterday, well, I think the proposal at the end of the talk was that Bantu languages might have started out as topic prominent languages, and then the development of subject could have come later. Okay, whatever we think about that, it's certainly true that when you look at prosodic phrasing, that subjects and topics are commonly phrased separately, which could argue that they have something in common and that they are somehow a special constituent, not quite as well integrated into the rest of the sentence in the languages where that's found. Okay, but we should start out by mentioning that, of course, there are a lot of languages with the subjects and also topics phrased with the following verb with the rest of the sentence. So this is not a Bantu-wide phenomenon. There are lots of languages where the subject phrases with the following verb, but there are also lots of languages where it doesn't. Yeah, so I'll just give a couple of examples here. So first, in Tumbuka, yeah, we can see that, yeah, the subject consistently phrases separately from the rest of the sentence. And you also get some different cues to this phrasing than what you find sentence finally. So final devoicing and final lengthening are definitely sentence final phenomena. They're not found typically after subjects or topics. But what you do find is an optional continuation rise. So this is, well, I can see this is very unreadable. I'm sorry, but yeah, but you can see the pitch mark. So this is a repetition of the same sentence by the same person, just saying the same sentence twice in a row. And in this case, at the end of the subject, it goes down and then goes way down. In the second case, he goes a bit down but comes back up. So this is why I'm talking about the continuation rise at the end of the subject and then quite compressed following that. Okay, then I just want to mention quickly, since this construction was discussed in a couple of talks yesterday, yeah, that inversion of the subject is commonly found, and in the case of subject inversion, what you expect is for the verb and the following subject to phrase together. So the verb and what follows tends to phrase together in most Bantu languages, whether it's a subject, an inverted subject, or the object. Okay, so the generalization that emerges from the phrasing of subjects is that, well, we do have a certain number of Bantu languages, quite a number, that phrase a subject separately. And the proposal in the literature is that subjects are phrased separately when they're topicalized. What are the implications for Proto-Bantu? Well, that phrasing the subject, I would propose that even though I think phrasing the entire sentence as one prosodic domain would be what you'd want to reconstruct for Proto-Bantu, I think that phrasing topics or subjects separately, it would be a fairly early development, but I guess that also depends on what we think, determine word order and the syntax of Proto-Bantu. Okay, adverbials are, for adverbials, we also find a similar range of phrasing as for subjects. In some languages, the adverbials, like with the knife here, phrase with the rest of the sentence somehow. Yeah, this is a more complicated example. So I'll turn to easier examples. Okay, so in Kinyambo, there's a tonal process that shows that all of the words in this sentence phrase together as a single prosodic phrase. Okay, but other languages like Chilungu, adverbials never phrase with the rest of the sentence, even if the rest of the sentence only consists of one word. Okay, what's interesting in Zulu, kind of an intermediate case, is that adverbials phrase separately from the rest of the sentence. If the rest of the sentence consists of more than a verb, if you have a verb plus a complement. But if the verb doesn't have an object, if the only complement is an adverb, then the adverb phrases with the verb. Okay, so again, implications for Proto-Bantu. Yeah, that adverbials are topic-like constituents, are often considered frame setters. And so it's also plausible that adverbials, like other kinds of topics, started phrasing separately from the rest of the sentence quite early, perhaps as early as Proto-Bantu. Okay, so since I'm running out of time. Yeah, so the last context I wanted to take up is phrasing within verb phrases. So a verb plus their complements, or verb plus their objects. What are the range of phrasing possibilities? Well, we already looked, I mean, of course, if the entire sentence is always phrased together, then that means that the verb and its objects also are phrased together. So that's one possibility. Yeah, but another possibility is for there to be a phrase break between the two objects. And I presented a couple of languages here illustrating this possibility. Yeah, so Tumbuka, again, is one. It not only phrases the subject from the rest of the sentence, but you also consistently find a phrase break between two objects. And the quick way to see that is to count the long vowels. Yeah, but the only long vowels are found in P notes. There's no contrastive vowel length in this language. Okay, and Chinwini, again, Chinwini is a more complicated example. So maybe I won't go over that, but if you have questions about Chinwini, it's a fascinating language. I'm sorry that I keep wavering. Yeah, when I was a student at Chuck's, it was Chinwini. I mean, the pronunciation has changed to Chinwini in my lifetime, and I'm not entirely used to it. Okay. Right, so let me just, yeah, so the implications here for Proto-Bantu, well, yeah, it's a bit complicated here. I mean, I still think maybe this is more of a belief than a scientifically founded opinion. I still believe that the wider phrasing that for a sentence to form a single prosodic phrase is an older phenomenon, that would be more likely to be what you find in Proto-Bantu. But on the other hand, the phrasing where you split the two objects, where you have phrase break between the two objects, is fairly widespread in the Bantu-speaking world. Okay, but I still think that this would be a later development. But what could have happened fairly early is that modified nouns tend to be followed by phrase breaks. So it could be that just in this context where you have a modified noun, that this could have fairly early started having an effect on phrasing. but we don't have much data on this topic. It's very frustrating that almost everyone who talks at all about prosodic phrasing talks about what happens with a verb plus one object, but a verb plus two object, and a verb plus adverbials. This kind of phrasing information is very hard to find. So to sum up, these are the tendencies that I think are that you find in modern languages that I think are plausibly reconstructed for Proto-Bantu. So I think there must have been some cues that signaled the sentence as a domain, and perhaps the sentence final cues are the ones that are most likely. The final lowering seems to be quite widespread, especially if you take in languages that avoid sentence final high tones. Final lengthening and final devoicing are expected on cross-linguistic grounds. Declination is widespread, but no means universal, so I'm not sure I'd want to reconstruct that for Proto-Bantu. But the sentence does form an entire domain for many other kinds of tonal processes, and I would say this could go back to Proto-Bantu. On the other hand, it seems like it's probably an early development for subjects and adverbials, topic-like constituents to phrase separately, and also for length to start to have an effect on phrasing, and phrasing modify noun phrases separately. Well, there are many reasons that could happen, but the fact that they add extra length to the sentence is a plausible reason for that. Okay, so there's lots more work to be done. But I thank you. Thank you.
Yes, we have some. The questions are already coming up.
Okay. I'm just going to go arbitrarily from left to right. So, Gerhard and Larry.
About the lengthening of the penal syllable, I would like to point to your attention that the Northern Bobe language, A31A, has a very specific type of penal prominence, which is realized in the following way. If the onset of the final syllable is realized with a consonant, which contains a consonant, that consonant which immediately follows the penal syllable is geminate, very audibly geminate. If there is an empty onset in the final syllable, which occurs quite frequently in Northern Bobe, then the penal syllable, the penal vowel is lengthened. So that's a very clear example, it seems to me, of penal prominence, and it's found far away from Eastern Bantu, but that stresses once more the resemblance of the Bobe language, typologically at least, to Eastern Bantu.
Is that word level or is it phrasal?
As far as I could hear, which the information comes from transcriptions, of course, done by Bolekia in this dictionary, but I listened to a religious site which has versions of the Gospel according to Luke in many different languages, and it seemed, I would think word level. But of course, I mean, it's difficult to work on those video.
There are very few of those. I mean, the only other one I know is Como in Zone D.
Is that right?
Yeah. Otherwise, it's always phrasal.
No, I think, but I wouldn't, I wouldn't put my hand.
It'd be nice to know more.
I think it's from what I could hear, it's well.
Okay. Thanks. So I'd like to get that reference during the coffee break.
Yeah, you've given us a lot to think about. One of the advantages of your proposal is that we know that there's this phenomenon of boundary narrowing, where something starts with a whole utterance and then gets, it gets generalized to parts of utterances. That's one thing that seemed to go in favor of that. Another thing is that even extremely closely related languages can be vastly different in this respect. I'm working on Luganda versus Lusoga right now, which are virtually mutually intelligible. I have not found any internal distinctions in Lusoga, whereas Luganda is famous for having different degrees, different kinds of prosodic domains, that the rules just take place. The rule of high tone anticipation just goes across anything. Kind of thing. Whereas Luganda, the subject or anything, any preverbal, it has more what I was expecting to see, although I've forgotten about some of the ones you cited there, including my own work, that there are more languages that seem to distinguish between what precedes the verb versus what follows the verb. Because I think of that as very asymmetric. You know, as you said also that.
Yeah, there is an asymmetry. I just,
Yeah.
Mal kept putting up the time signs
Yeah.
as it was. So
Well, you
I
had
knew
that
I
there.
couldn't discuss everything.
No, we expect the verb to go with what follows
Yeah.
rather than with what precedes if there's a difference.
Right, but there
Yeah.
is a variation across Bantu languages about whether it's a subject that goes with everything else. I think Hai is like that, and what comes after the verb is phrased separately, or the reverse. I guess the Ganda is a reverse with the subject separate and everything after phrases together. Yeah, so there's more variation than I could cover. Yeah, but it is puzzling that closely related languages can be very different in their phrasing. Let's see, Khan.
Yeah, I'm thinking, it was very thought-provoking, and I want to look at all sorts of data that I have, but I want to mention two things. One is, I once gave a paper on Malila in Gothenburg. I think you were there. And there is something...
Many years ago, Khan.
Yes, about 10 years ago. But there was something like shortening. And I'm thinking of, well, what I'm thinking of is within noun phrases, might there be two types of noun phrases according to different prosodic boundaries, whereby one type causes shortening of long vowels if they're not penultimate. And then considering the two noun plus possessive pronoun as a closer knit unit than when they don't lengthen.
Right, and there are a certain number of languages. I mean, again, there's some complications that I couldn't get into. I kept skipping over Chimini, but it's in a way like that, but it has contrasted vowel length, but the vowels can only occur, I think, in antepenal or penal position within a prosodic phrase. I think also Kimatumbi is a language that has long vowels shortened except in the penal. So penal lengthening, I guess, are the favoring long vowels in the penal syllable is that emerges through different processes, and I couldn't cover all of them, but yeah, thanks for.
But what I was thinking was there were two types, because for some the vowel didn't shorten of the noun when the modifier was added, and for some it did shorten. And that was the particular interest, and I haven't got any solutions or so, but I noticed that, and it was very interesting.
Right, so you're right. So I was emphasizing, well, I also skipped over this data, but it's in the handout. Yeah, but nouns and modifiers, on the one hand, people expect them to phrase together. So if people, okay, if scholars interested in prosodic phrasing look at any phrasal context, the verb plus the object is commonly looked at, and a noun plus a modifier is commonly looked at. And so one gets the impression that nouns and all modifiers should phrase together, but actually, I am reminded, now I do remember this paper. Yeah, and it's a good example of a language where some modifiers phrase with the noun and some don't. And that is a puzzle. I don't think enough people have looked at it.
No,
so there isn't a good solution yet. Yeah, that's a good point.
And I would like to add something probably similar to some Giryama data I have, where lexical tone patterns on noun merge with the high tone on possessive pronouns. That's a whole complex analysis that needs, but there is some merging of tone patterns of the two into one for the whole unit. I don't know if that works with all the noun phrases internally or not, or again, like in Malila, with the shortening only for certain types that are closer knit units than for other types that are less closer knit units in the minds of people, of course.
Right, yeah, also Chichewa, the noun plus possessor forms a unit for certain tone processes. Yeah, so there's a lot, even more complications than I could think of. Yeah, and again, the question is how widespread those are, but we don't have the data, to see how widespread they are, to see what, if they're an aerial feature or,
I don't know much about the subject, so this is it's rather me asking for more information. But about the part of the conclusions on the utterance final position, I was wondering, is this really something typically Bantu, or is it more a universal tendency? Because if it is a universal tendency, then I would say we don't really have to reconstruct that.
which one again? I didn't hear the beginning.
The utterance final position, so about final lowering, final devoicing, final lowering.
Okay, well, I think that's a good question. Yeah, I was also thinking, so on the one hand, final lowering is supposed to be very widespread in the world's languages. On the other hand, when scholars say that, when they say the world's languages, they're speaking about the top 10. Yeah, Chinese, Japanese, English, Dutch, German, I mean, yeah. So, right, and what we want to notice in that collection of languages is that most of them are not tone languages. So I don't think for other tone languages that the final lowering processes that you find across Bantu are so common. I mean, I don't know, but I think Kisworth and Odin in their chapter on tone in Bantu highlight the avoidance of final high tones as something they think of as typically Bantu. Yeah, so if that's typically Bantu, I think it is related to these intonational processes of final lowering, and I think this is something typically Bantu, maybe beyond Bantu, maybe also Niger-Congo, but I think it's something special about tone languages in this part of the world. Yeah. Oh, but I see lots of people listening to that.
In the interest of
That's
time,
fun. Oh, wow.
I think maybe one short question, and you see, time also happens to me. I'm not responsible for it. I also had a question, but I have to cut it short. One
Okay, so
very
who went
short
up first?
I think
Okay,
it's well, you didn't mention anything about, I don't know how much work there's on low tones at the end. And so, is there variation in whether low tones get lower, or do the highs just go down to the low level? I mean, is this study?
Oh, well, that is the short question, so I can give a short answer.
Yeah.
But there's also language variation there.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's some languages where both high and low tones go down. There's some where only low tones, and others where only high, so there is variation.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you. Yeah.